Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. My name is David Plylar, and I'm in the concert office in the music division of the Library of Congress. And I'm really happy to be able to speak with you tonight about this program that I am really looking forward to, and I'm sure that you all will as well, with Marc-André Hamelin, who will be playing the Concord Sonata of Charles Ives, the second piano sonata, as well as Waldszenen. Schumann Waldszenen, which I will not be speaking about tonight. Unfortunately, I love this piece, but we're just not going to have enough time to go into it. Plus Ravel's Gaspard de Nuit, which is, if you know this literature, two of the pieces on this program are known as some of the most difficult things out there that still get played. So it's going to be quite something to hear them back to back like this. We will also be hearing a new composition of Mr. Hamelin's that was written in celebration of our 100th anniversary of our concert series. So it'll be a fun thing there. I haven't heard it yet, so it'll be a mazurka that we'll hear on the second half of the program. So we'll go ahead and get started. I always have this problem where I get too excited about this stuff and I put too much in. So we're still going to go fairly fast through this material, but with the idea being that the Concord Sonata, which is what we'll start with, is a piece that you have to live with for quite some time before it really starts to pay dividends in terms of rewarding your attention. It does so from the very beginning, I think, as well, but I would recommend it in this way so that you find the things that that kind of speak to you and that might give you an entryway into this piece, because it is something of a monster of a piece, and then see where that leads you. And so my goal today will be just to give you a few ideas about possible things that you might consider thinking about, especially with respect to how Ives and then Ravel deal with technical issues and specifically textures that they create with the piano. And they're kind of rooted in coming from the same type of standpoint, but they have very different means of getting where they're going. Another thing about this is that they are writing these pieces contemporaneously, kind of. Ives started in 1905, if you look at his earliest bit, that was, I think, an Orchard House overture that would turn into the Alcotts, and that was in 1905. And then gradually he created his first version that finished it in 1920, and then sent it out along with a kind of very large book that was called Essays Before a Sonata. So he sent out the sonata itself, plus the essays before sonata, to a select group of people who didn't know him, for the most part. And this was the way that he first kind of let this piece out into the world. And over time, he kept working on it, he kept playing it. He was an improviser. He would develop it over the years, until finally there was a second version that was released in 1947. And that's the version that we're mostly going to hear tonight. There are some little things that are different, as we'll find out. But, so we'll start with He Came, He Saw, He Conquered. I'd like to thank Hyperion Records for giving me permission to play some, Marc-André Hamelin made a recording of the Concord Sonata about, I think, 20 or so years ago. And so I've got some excerpts from him, and then Stephen Osborne has a recording of Gaspard that we're able to use. So I really appreciate that. And you will too, because then you don't have to listen to me talking, you just hear the music. So we're going to be looking, as I kind of mentioned, how piano technique and textures can serve as sort of modes of invention and referential tools as you're listening to this music. So Charles Ives is kind of a tough nut to crack, and I'm not really sure, where to start with him. But with this particular sonata, it's important to look at it as it's almost like a four-part character study, but character is too small of a word for it, because each movement kind of represents almost a philosophy or a body of work that he's referencing in different ways, and he references them rather obliquely in the Essays Before a Sonata, although at times he does make some pretty direct relationships between his different conceptions of character and what he actually does in the music. So I won't actually talk too much about the Essays Before Sonata because I've written about them in the notes, so you can see a bit more about how those things fit in, except for a couple of very special occasions. Okay. So transcendentalism, which I also won't get into now, you could think of these as almost transcendentalist etudes, where they're studies in this sense. And actually, now that I think about it, he went back and turned some of the music into studies, piano studies. The first one that we start with is Emerson, and we're talking about Ralph Waldo himself. And this is the first two systems of the page. And just a word about how I'm going to be referencing these things. You'll notice something is missing, namely bar lines. So this makes it really hard to reference, measure, it creates some problems. So what you'll see at the bottom is it says kind of the name of the movement, the name of the piece, the name of the movement, and it says P1, that stands for page 1, and then S is system 1 and 2. So that's like how it goes across. Occasionally you'll see an M for measure if there is a measure, and he does occasionally use measures when he's feeling, very generous there. But I'm also not going to focus on a sort of motivic analysis in this case because it would be a very long, even much longer talk that we're already looking at. But I will mention a few times that you will hear what we might call the Beethoven motive. And so I'm just going to play this beginning and see if you can hear it. So just right at the very end there, it's actually embedded elsewhere in that excerpt as well. But you hear that da-da-da-dum. And what's interesting is that lots of times when he puts this forward, what we're hearing is a minor third version of it, whereas the Beethoven original, which you hear, is a major third. But then you hear the minor third right after it. So that's why in our collective minds we've got this sense of what this sounds like. And so he's playing on this in a very interesting way that we'll see. So one of the things that Ives does that is both helpful and overwhelming at times is he'll look at delineating lines through registral differentiation, and he has special notation that he does how he does this, often through multiple staves. So you'll see 3 or more staves. But what you can see is that he keeps things so that you can hear lines that you're supposed to keep hearing in one staff while other lines are continuing under other ones. And you can follow them if you have it in front of you like this. It's not sight readable, but it's followable. So here's what this sounds like here. And for anybody who might be panicking about what they're hearing, just saying, "Oh no, what am I in for with this, giant piece?" That's it is in many ways a modernist piece, but there are things that are happening that, again, with further study, you start to see, oh, this is kind of where he's going with this. This is what he was doing. It makes sense. He sets up his own Ivesian logic that really comes through, and there's moments of excessive beauty, I think. And there's also moments of lots of crunch, and most of that crunch comes in to play in the first movement, Emerson. Another thing that he does that is both helpful and a hindrance if one wanted to try to play this at sight, which, as one does, is that we have lines that are differentiated with dynamics. And in this example, you'll see little carrots and things like that are kind of holding and positioning forte signs with very specific chords. Or you'll see a piano a piano dynamic that applies to one particular line. So he's setting up saying, here's the 5 different dynamics I want you to play at the same time, and here's the easy way to see it and understand it. So thank you, Ives. Here's what this sounds like. interesting thing that pops up here is that you'll see in that bottom system there, maybe you can see it, it's a little bit small, but it says solo right in the center. And this is not typically something you see in piano music where you're already the soloist, like this guy's big chance, to play, or what, I don't know. But in this case, I think it has a reference point to an earlier work where this may have come from, which is called the Emerson Concerto. And this was a piece that was never finished, but there had been some reconstructions of it. But it's based on the same material, and it had some, so it had some play in that way. And he eventually ended up, using this material with 4 transcriptions after Emerson. So he got as much out of this music as he possibly could. And then, we go from these really, dense materials to something quite different. So the role of simplicity and the role of taking a step back is just as big of a compositional decision and an important one for music of all types and composers. You're writing this kind of music is that they have to give somebody a break mentally, I think, as well as physically, so that the pianist can, have somebody come in and wipe all the sweat off of them or something. But it plays a big role in the Concord Sonata because of the nature of the simple tunes. And in fact, it turns out that there's a kind of a through line with a lot of the simpler tunes as they're related to kind of an idea that comes back through the entire sonata that has been called the human faith theme, or the human faith idea. And these things come through, and they're very related to the Beethoven element that we mentioned before, but I'll get back into that in a moment. So here's another big moment where Ives is employing all kinds of different figurations and articulations in rapid succession. And these, it lets you hear a whole bunch of different lines in different ways, and then everything kind of collapses into Beethoven again. I think this is, it's very small over here, I should get my glasses on, but I think this is a spot where it goes to at the pitch of Beethoven's original, but with Ivesian chords on top of it. So now it says very fast there. It's like, because it was supposed to be a bit more jazzy. Beethoven didn't realize it at the time, but that's where it is headed. Another thing, and again, I know I'm just kind of going through these very quickly, but it's just the way we got to do it if we're going to get through it. There's a kind of a sound cloud approach, what I think of as a sound cloud, where he'll create this mass of sound, and out of that, you'll hear a very, like a triad or something like that, a very simple chord that will come through, and it has a very special, in Hawthorne in particular, it has a very special role. But here's an example of it here. Very quiet. So I'll stop it right there. So that's what happens is that the pedal is down, and then when you lift it, that's when we start to hear that that really tiny, thin resonance that still comes through, and it's an effect that's really powerful if you can pull it off. Other times he tries to make it a little bit easier for the pianist, although he was known in his epilogue of the Essays Before Sonata to say something along the lines of, who cares about the pianist? I mean, it's if you have to write, you're writing the music, and if it's if that's what the music needs to be, then that's what it needs to be. So tough, But at the same time, he's able to play it, or at least somewhat. And there's some recordings of him playing parts of it. Although there's parts, I think that some of those recordings where he's saying like, I can't do this, or something gruffly, like when, and so he just plays a little bit snippets. So, but he, he could put up there. Anyway, so there are some places where the notation looks very complicated, but he's allowing the hands to work together at the same rates. And that's a big deal to have that on occasion, and it makes some of these things easier to manage. So something that looks extra complicated, this is still very hard, don't get me wrong, but you can hear how it works together as a particular gesture. And so what's happening there in that left hand is that the left hand is playing along with the right hand, and then it crosses over and hits that top note and then comes back down. So it's like this gesture that kind of creates this sort of arc physically. And so anyway, that's a very romantic gesture. So everybody should know that, just in case they need that in your arsenal of gestures. But that is something that you'll see in Romantic literature, and Ravel in particular. And so, as an example of this, I'll just play this. This is the example of, we have 3 different levels of accentuation. And this happens just by nature. It's the same thing as if you have a piece that starts on a pitch, there's a certain primacy that comes to that pitch. If it ends on a pitch, there's also a certain weight that comes with that ending on that. The same thing happens at the local level. If you have an arpeggio or something like that, there's going to be weight on that bottom, there's going to be weight on the top, and if you're Ives, you'll make it so that you have to play some stuff in the middle too that gets extra play. So this is an example of a very romantic sort of situation. So you can hear how it's that same crossing kind of pattern. Maybe not the same exact chord you might expect. You find those in people like Ravel and Liszt. Another thing that happens is that I always wondered, why did Ives decide to call this a sonata and write in this particular way? And I think that there's certain types of classicist, also kind of romantic types of gestures that one does that kind of makes it fall into this category. There's also, of course, arguments for structurally how it has certain aspects of sonata, which we're not going to get into, but I do want you to hear this sort of basic variation technique. So when you're developing an idea, a lot of times a classical variation set would have an acceleration of the accompaniment, so that you go from a duple sort of setting to a triple or something like that, so that it just gets faster. What's interesting here is that Ives keeps the same melodic shapes above, but covers much more territory with it in the second one. So these are 2 examples that come across. They're about 2 pages apart in the original, but you can hear how it's the same pitch material for the most part. There's some inversional relationships. Again, we won't get into, but what it ends up doing is it makes them start and end in the same place. So here's the first one, which is the top system there. And I have to say, this whole section is very dreamlike and just gorgeous, so I think you're going to really enjoy it if you don't know this piece. First of all, how many people know this piece, the Concord Sonata? Okay, so not too many people, so you're in for a real treat. So you can see how basically it's the same melody on the top, but then it's just much faster stuff happening underneath it, and those are triplets, so it got much faster. And it's funny that because he says, again, I need to put my glasses back on, but it says fast but slower than the preceding part, and then quite fast again for the second one. So he's expecting you to have this sort of relational, this is a good point I should bring up. In addition to paying attention to all the details that he puts in the score, he also says that you can be flexible with the tempo. So that on that first page where it has a single tempo marking, he's expecting you to change the tempo as needed, but not as needed technically, but as needed musically. And so this is something that you'll hear in Hamelin's recording and many other recordings, that the tempo is variable, and he expects you to do that It doesn't tell you where it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to change, but it is an expectation that you're responding to it musically. And then we have a very different type of expression where it's using basically hollowed out notes that we might think of as whole notes up on the top there, but they're taking place in a quarter note's duration. And so the idea here is that it creates a certain psychological expectation, I think, so that we think, okay, these are like supposed to be these luminous chords that have a big sound to them. And here's what that sounds like. And what you might know, I mean, some of this is very Messiaen-like, I think, with when Messiaen was, knee-high to a, whatever the phrase is. But you can hear also that that's the same material that we were just listening to, and has now been, the acceleration has increased even more, so that we're having those 16th notes moving beneath this, this notation that the audience doesn't see, but the performer does, and I think it has a psychological effect. It might be like, why don't you just write quarter notes? That might be the psychological effect of disdain at that, but I think it's more of a quality of sound issue. Then we have other types of classical notions, like the turn. It's kind of weird to have this thick texture and a turn show up. Here's what that sounds like. So what I'm talking about when I say a turn is that there's this little, like it's a backwards S that fell on its side above the fourth note there. And so that's an indication to do a particular ornament that is an older ornament that you wouldn't typically find in this kind of a piece. But it's there, and of course there is a huge repertoire of pieces that still used it very close to the composition of this time, like in thinking of Wagner's operas, almost every single Wagner opera has a prominent turn featured in different ways. But this is something that is still part of a tradition, and again, it kind of anchors this into the sonata world as well. We then have one other thing I want to point out on this page is that if you see that forte, that big F at the top, it's pointing to a particular note. So you're supposed to be playing that turn to make it go into that voice and make it pop out. So you can critique the pianist tonight and see, let him know what you think afterwards. No, I'm just kidding. But it's kind of insane to do that. But at times Ives decides that he wants to be that specific about having a particular voice come out. Usually it's a C, and it's one of the reasons that some people think that there's a kind of a C-ness to this piece. So like especially, you have the C minor symphony of the Beethoven reference, but then you have a huge C major section in the Alcatz. But in any case, it's one of those things it's kind of fun to notice when he accents those types of things. There's other types of textures that come up, and those would be contrapuntal ones. And so here's, for instance, a quasi-fugal statement that doesn't continue, but it starts off this way. Here's how it goes. So that type of contrapuntal figuration is something that is another way to differentiate sections. And then it's still, we can always come back to the Beethoven. So it becomes more and more frantic and more kind of over the top. And then at the end, there is a viola part that pops into it. And this is that's what that sounds like, but in this recording, he's not playing the viola part. I don't know what's going to happen tonight. We'll see. But, and again, this is we think it's a holdover from the Emerson Concerto version of the piece, because that would be the type of thing that one would find in a transcription. You find this in Liszt transcriptions all the time, where it indicates an unplayable part, but it's like his way of saying, okay, yes, the violins are doing this 3 octaves above everything else while you're doing that. But since you can't like really, hit it with your ear or something like that, it's expected that you just know that I know, but play the piano part. And so that's kind of what happens there. And so I have heard cases where viola has been brought in for that, but it doesn't end well for anybody, really. Then we get to the Hawthorne movement. And this one, I've mentioned a little bit in the notes about what types of references are made, but this is where I think there's a lot of references to actual stories of Hawthorne. And there's lots of kind of projections one could do to look at this material and see this is that story or this is from that. And I'm not going to do that. But what is interesting is that you start to see these certain figurations come and go, and idiosyncratic notations as a way to kind of dictate the flow of time. And so I'm going to play this at the beginning of it so you can hear what this sounds like, but also just look at the top line, and you'll see that there's these kind of extra, what are those, 30-second notes that kind of get thrown in there. They're not meant to be meticulously counted. I think it's more that it's like a written-in sort of rubato, like a slowdown. And so here's what that sounds like. So you start to get these sort of episodic tableau, I would say, of ideas that are juxtaposed with one another, and it kind of creates a very interesting set of ideas. But you also have a continuation of a continued exploration of technical means of presenting the material. And here's a case, for instance, where that left hand is expected to go above the right hand, so that the right hand continues what it's doing, keeps that idea going strong. But the left hand creates a new line above, and you'll hear that. So again, that's a very short snippet, but when you're listening to the whole thing, you'll just be aware of, just think, okay, for now I'm going to focus on the middle voice and just hear what's happening in the middle of the piano, or I'm going to listen to the bass. It's usually to pick the bass or the high treble, and just listen to that and just see if you can follow it along. Ives in general will have a complete thought always with each of those different levels. You'll be surprised at how how it's easy to actually attend to them and get something out of it that way if you're feeling overwhelmed by the whole. Another interesting thing about this is the use of a board to affect certain types of clusters. So in the case, what you see above there is the kind of what you can use your arm for as well, but a cluster against a melody in the left hand, and kind of rolled chords in the left hand as well. Here's a little bit of what that sounds like. So it's not something that's going to overwhelm you and hit you upside with the board, but what it does do is it creates a whole line that you can follow, a musical line that just happens to encompass, a dozen notes at the same time. And so this is the kind of thing that Ives would do, and just do it, and it would be an innovative idea, but it was always in service of some musical reason. Sometimes he liked to stay where he was at, too. And so what he would do to make the music very interesting is he would change the articulation around. So we'll go from a very legato situation to a staccato one. So in the hands of a really great pianist, you can hear that difference, and it kind of creates the sudden, like, oh, wait, we're still in the same, pitch space, but we're now in this very, something's happening here. We also have cases where there's something happening with the right hand, and the left hand is doing something different. So first we hear this. And then later, a couple pages later, we hear this next version. But what's interesting here is that the right hand stays the same, but the left hand is playing different pitch content. rhythms are the same, the profiles of everything are the same, the shapes are the same, but the music is different, and it has this feeling of, you feel like, okay, this is the same music, but it's changed somehow. And so it's not so important, I think, for Ives to say, how did it change now? Tell me exactly, what happened. It's more that you register it viscerally, that there's something going on that you recognize, but something's different at the same time. Then in this same section, there's this sort of musette sort of situation that comes up. And this is the only place in the whole piece that has a repeated figure. And so what you'll find is that in Hawthorne, we're getting more and more of these moves toward something that is referential to existing music that you might be aware of outside of the world of this particular piece. Beethoven keeps coming. So fate knocking at the door. And then we have one of my favorite ideas that comes in, and this is what I mentioned earlier about the sound clouds. This is where that comes into play in a very interesting way, where the depression of the very quiet chords from within the context of the loud chords allows something that sounds like a hymn tune to come through. But you'll notice the shape of the hymn tune is also very familiar for the one that we just heard before this. Okay, so, sorry. He doesn't let it last very long. But the idea is, this is where I think that there's what one might call either a programmatic idea or some type of an extra musical thing here that might be identifiable. And this is the idea of passing a church and hearing a hymn tune coming through while something else is going on, whatever that is. Apparently you need to get away from it. It sounds pretty violent. And this is important because it's kind of like this sort of sacred and profane juxtaposition there, and that becomes kind of it becomes a transformed thing in the next movement with the Alcotts, and I'll mention that in just a moment. But it's a wonderful effect. Can be difficult at times to pull off, but you might have also noticed that it was polytonal, so that you hear something coming out of a different key than one might expect it to be. And then we get to a reference that he makes to his own music. Here's what that sounds like. So remember, this is part of the same movement that started off with the will-o'-the-wisp kind of stuff. This is the kind of out there stuff. And you might recognize that from Three Places in New England. The second movement is basically the full one, but he also has the country band march as a separate piece, and he uses it elsewhere. It just, for him, has a certain referential importance. And it's, again, you have this sense of you're passing by. I don't know if it's passing you or you're passing it, but there's passing happening. And then we get to references to ragtime, I think. It's a little bit harder to pin this down but listen to how this sounds. So everything becomes slightly off kilter. It's never fully predictable. And eventually we get to this point where it starts to have this sort of sound to it. But it has everything to do with the particular displacement of accents or putting them into particular places where a pattern will allow those accents to emerge in a particular way that is exciting and interesting. And then you might have the melody become suddenly, everything else is on the straight and narrow, but then you have the melody itself gets displaced. until the end when it comes back together. So it's like this, you have this sort of phasing thing that's happening, well before Steve Reich, and but then everything kind of snaps back right at that second system there. Then you have one of the great cluster passages in the literature, as I like to call it. We don't have as many of those as we'd like, but here's what that sounds like, where we have, in the context of the music, the clusters develop into this life of their own. Here's what that sounds like. So one of the wonderful things about this, I think, is that it, just like with the board music earlier, it gives you a sense of how lines and shapes can be created with bodies of notes, clusters of sound. And it doesn't require just a single idea, a single pitch to give a shape to a motivic idea or something like that. You can create these shapes in these other ways. And Ives isn't the only person who does this, but he does it in a way that's compelling, and that's important. Then we have these other types of textures that emerge like this. So it kind of goes back and forth between these extremes. That's where, just like kind of the point I like to make about this one. And we still keep coming back to Beethoven. And then at the end, we have a return to that hymn idea. And now what's going to happen is that we're going to invert this idea of being outside of some sort of space where there's some type of communal singing happening and moving into the house of the Alcotts. And in this case, this is where, and again, I won't get into it here just for time reasons, but you get this sense of it being the Alcott's home and the March home from Little Women with Louisa May's. But seriously, because they both had, the young sister who dies, and so this is now moving that space of this music into the house. And then we have this passage where it continues on. I won't play it, but right hand's in B flat and the left hand's in A flat. And so this sort of polytonal thing is actually something that plays in different ways throughout the sonata. But now we have, in my view, what's happening is that we have a display. We have what had been sort of the sacred space that we're on the outside of. It turns into the place where the family is, where the home is, and that's where this particular music has its greatest life. And so you'll start to hear how this hymn tune in particular starts to sound like, to transform the Beethoven idea. So here's that, we're in the C minor spot. And he does these wonderful things where he just puts this little, note like something's just getting a twang that hasn't quite tuned. I don't know, it gives it some flavor that it wouldn't have otherwise. And then he juxtaposes this with an idea that music that to me sounds like it's the tune that everybody knows, but you've seen it in a Ken Burns documentary probably, but you can't quite identify it. And I don't think Ken Burns uses this, but that's just what it makes me think of. It's panning over, old pictures of, like somebody laying back with a hat on, and That's just what comes to my mind. And there's this sort of beautiful aside that just it comes up twice, and that's it. And then we have the biggest instance of what people have called the human faith theme, and they call it that not because they think it represents human faith, but that's because that's one of the few things that Ives identified as being a theme that comes back. And it's always varied, so it's never quite the same. But here's the biggest, this is what it sounds like. I think I have to do, here's what it sounds like. And I'm not going to play the next one just for time, but it then has a little tag as a coda at the end of the movement that you'll hear. We then move to Thoreau, and this is another interesting movement. All of these are interesting, but here we'll hear different types of figuration again. Some of this is similar to what you heard in Hawthorne. Sometimes it becomes something where everything is diffuse and suddenly comes together at a very particular moment, and you can see it in the music. And there you have a built-in sort of situation at the end there that's an interesting one rhythmically. But there's what I think is happening in this movement in particular is a lot of things coming apart and coming back together. This is a theme that seems to kind of carry across the whole sonata, but you'll notice that in this one as well. There's also this very, like you're in the woods and you're lost, and there's an ostinato that's following you, and it keeps playing like as you're walking, and this is kind of what it sounds like. Looking around. There are other references to other musics that are happening here. I won't get into, but it's the ostinato thing is kind of it's to me it does have something to do with walking, and I think that's because of the Thoreau connection. I have no basis for that in reality, but that's just what it makes me think of. We have other effects. I'm not going to play this one, but this is where he asks you to hold the pedal while he changes harmonies underneath it, and he'll be very specific about what he's asking you to do that, and then he'll do it the same way, but slightly different, and that's what happens here, but I'm going to skip those for time. He has other types of figurations where everything will become super big and then contract into something that's more reasonable. So you notice that what's happening is there's like one fewer note each time that you have the chords, and so those would be sort of a mechanistic type of way of making some type of change happen. And of course, one of the the strangest parts of the Concord piano sonata is the ending. And so there's we hear the flute there, and there's actually a flute part in the score. It's nice when you can have it, but if you don't, he gave another version of it that has just a piano-only version. And so right now I'm going to very quickly switch to Ravel, and we're going to look a little bit at Gaspard and Nuit. which is a name that it makes me, I had a similar nickname in college. But it's built, basically, there are three poems that Ravel chose from Aloysius Bertrand, and who wrote 53 poems that are collectively called Gaspard de la Nuit. And Ondine is one of them, and that's the first one. And it's each one is preceded by a poem. We didn't reproduce them, but you should definitely check it out. It's interesting because they're narrative poems. And it starts with an exhortation to listen. And what Ravel does here, again, we're looking at something that's about a little bit contemporaneous with 1911, 1912, with what Ives was doing, but in a very different sphere, and one that is very firmly in the romantic impressionistic camp. But what we hear is, I think, one of the harder parts of the whole piece, which is to balance the quiet murmuring of the water at the very beginning. Here's what that sounds like. So that idea starts to get a different type of mobility with the right hand, so that we start to hear, just like it's a different way of dealing with registral effects. It's now that the main idea that you're thinking of is still in one particular register, like one particular area, but then the other hand is doing something to make it so that it colors it very differently. So here's what's happening as that same idea comes into play in a different way. So we hear it, you hear all those different ideas, but in three different octaves. And then we start to get all kinds of different accompaniments that come into play, and they all have to be balanced against keeping that melodic line going. So Ondine is singing her song, and we need to hear that song, but we also need to hear what's supporting it, the water effects and things like that. So we still hear some of that murmuring at the very end, but otherwise we have these like very big scales that are happening, and different ways of basically engaging the keyboard. I like to think of it as like waking up the keyboard so that it can kind of speak to us in different ways. And here's just another example of some of that. So we see Ravel using three staves as well for this, with the same exact intent that Ives did. That is to make it so clear that what voice is supposed to be where, and how we're supposed to play it, or how one is supposed to play it. I can't play this, but for those who can. And then it leads up to kind of a famous spot where the Ondine is asking, supposedly, potentially, for you to come on down and join her. And so what looks like incredibly difficult music is, but at the same time, there's certain patterns that are being used to kind of create these effects. And so Ravel wasn't the greatest pianist, but it was something that he knew about and was able to work with people to could make it into a reality, these ideas that would create these washes of sound that could only be found really in Liszt's music and of course then Debussy. But you also find it in Chopin as well. Here's, I'm gonna skip this one, but this is another example of how that left hand will cross over and create all kinds of interesting things in the context of a very complicated sort of thing, but the idea of it, you can still hear the melody very clearly at all times. Then we have glissandi. So things like that. And then we have this special moment when suddenly, like I mentioned earlier with the simplicity, juxtaposing simplicity next to complexity, we have this single line. I'll stop there, but it's something you might think of that as the answer to the entreaty, like, thanks but no thanks. And then we have kind of a celebrated passage where Undine is either crying or laughing or doing both at the same time, and this is what that sounds like. And then we have, at the very end, we have this passage I think is worth listening to that reminds me of Liszt and Chopin. So the pieces in particular that I'm thinking of, the A-flat major etude Chopin, opus 25, number 1. There's the fifth transcendental etude of Franz Liszt, the Fou Follet. That is the other one. And then there's also Liszt's Les Jeux d'eau de la Villa d'Este. And that's has another relationship, I think, to Ravel. But it's a relationship that you'd know if you heard it. The second piece is Le Gibet, and this one is kind of a scary one, and I'm going to very quickly go over it just to say that this is an image is that we have is a body in a cage that has been there for some time, and is that's what the wanderer sees, and it's slow. It's a slow burn. We hear this repeated B flat the entire time. Sometimes it's in different registers, but it's usually in the central one. So listen for that. Then we'll hear chords that come in on top of it, but we still hear that B flat. So there's that B flat again. And then we have, then we have cases where that B flat starts to move a little bit, just like I was mentioning with the Ives. This happens, but you don't hear it that way when you're listening to it. At least I don't. I don't hear it as a displacement. But you have to play it that way in order to be able to play the notes. So here's just a little bit of what that sounds like. And so you can hear how those quiet chords are coming in. They're their own little world in addition to that kind of repeated note. So it's this very haunting movement. Then we end with Scarbo, which always has this reputation as Ravel wanted to write it because he wanted to write something harder than Islam by Balakirev. And I think that's a bit overstated, so I just perpetuated it by saying it again. But there's something about it where the idea of making something difficult for its sake is not something that I think one should do, but there's a certain type of thing that one can create, in this case with repeated notes, that is something special. And you hear this in a lot of Liszt did all this as well before, but you'll hear just repeated notes. And that's very hard to really pull those off. And you have other types of textures that come into play. Then you have other big sounds that are coming underneath melodic snippets that aren't quite as big as you think they would be. You expect it to be bigger, but it's not. And this is kind of an important part of this. It's like you see Scarbo, who's this sort of little demon character, lots of places. I mean, right there. And he shows up in lots of different poems as well. In fact, there's 2 named Scarbo in the Bertrand set. Then we have those repeated notes turned into melodic ideas. Then we have those repeated notes become this sort of static place where there's it's kind of building up electric charge or something. And it's interrupted with this. So it's like it's building up tension by just kind of creating a static texture, but you know something is going to happen. And then what it turns into, Ravel is so good at creating these accompaniments that can continue beneath these ideas. Here's just one more example of that. And then, there's all this stuff continues. I'm not going to play this example, but there's lots of these different textures that are created, keep continuing, keep varying, and they all have to create this sense of continuity so that when you see a staccato line, it's going to be reminiscent of those repeated note types of figures. And that's one of the ways that Ravel develops ideas. Then we have things that turn into something that's much more involved, like, for instance, legato dyads in the right hand here you see in the second hand. And it becomes something where you're supposed to be playing everything very smoothly. It's not that it becomes harder as it keeps going. But there's these sort of technical things that are happening that create this wash of sound. Then we have like sort of an important part of like the climax of this piece are these interrupted continuities of what I was mentioning before, where you hear like just enough of a theme to think, oh, there's a theme, but then it doesn't continue. And here's the kind of where we arrive with Scarbo. So that da-da, that thing right there, that was earlier what was the kind of the interrupted that where we had that momentum kind of building up. That was the idea that was there. And now it becomes the focus, but it still doesn't get beyond itself. And so that's kind of how one might characterize a nihilistic sort of spirit or something like that, like Mephisto or Scarbo in this case, where they don't have this sort of creative, productive identity of their own necessarily, but they kind of taint everything that they're touching. So at the end, there's this image in the poem where the Scarbo is kind of built into this candle, and the candle it melts away, but it's not that like it's putting the candle out, but it's like literally that Scarbo is the candle and just dissipates as it burns out. And this is how Ravel does it at the end. This is how he manages that image. So you go from this idea of this sort of demonic presence to something that's actually much more of a playful one, more of like an elfin sort of, it's a visitor that continues to come back and plague this this particular person, whoever is the subject of these poems. So this was I know that I'm just about out of time, and so this was just a brief introduction into this material. I hope you enjoy all of it. It was a pleasure to speak with you about it, and we're going to open the doors very shortly and enjoy the concert. Thanks.